Dan. And it is great to be back with you. And thanks for just engaging in this time of being together in worship. Ashley, thanks for leading us so well. And something powerful about just allowing musicians and vocalists to bring us into God's presence. The psalmist said, we enter his gates with thanksgiving and praise. Literally, we enter into the presence of Jesus as we exalt and worship him. So I just love how well that was done this morning. Last week was Easter, and I heard you guys had a pretty significant Easter gathering, which is pretty awesome. Maybe you're here today, you came back, and so if you did, welcome, glad you're here. And I know Dan's going to be talking a little bit about what happens after Easter with some of the folks who are in that Easter story. What I want to do is, if you remember the Easter story, if you get into Acts chapter 1, you read about the ascension of Jesus, and as the disciples their minds are blown and they're staring up into the sky, there's a couple angels who say, hey, kind of get to it, the things that Jesus has asked you to get involved with. And the same way you saw Jesus leave, he's going to come back again. And I want to talk to you today about the return of Jesus. It's a topic that we don't talk about that much in churches, and there's reasons for that. In 1980, you can do the math here and figure out how old I am, but in 1980, I was a sophomore in high school. And I don't know who was talking about this, but in 1980, someone started talking about that in 1982, the planets were going to align. And this alignment of the planets was going to create some unusual phenomena on planet Earth, meaning that there would be these cosmological events that would take place that would create unusual tides. There would be earthquakes, there would be famines, there would be all this horrible stuff that would take place. And the word on our campus as a sophomore in high school was that this could only mean that Jesus was going to return in 1982. And I got to be honest with you, I was not happy about that because there were some things in life that I wanted to experience. I wanted to graduate from high school. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have children. I wanted to have grandchildren, and so I just wasn't very excited about the return of Jesus in 1982. Now, 1982 came and went. There was no unusual phenomena that took place. I did graduate from high school. I did go to college. I did get married. Trina, my wife's here, and we had 4 children. And funny thing was that I wasn't interested in the return of Christ. When we had our 4th child, I became very interested in the return of Christ. And I began praying Revelation chapter 22, verse 17, even so, come quickly, Lord Jesus. Your mind changes there a little bit. And you know, that group of people that were talking about this event that was supposed to happen in 1982, people have been prognosticating about the return of Jesus for a very, very long time. Richard Kyle, in his book called The Last Days Are Here Again, catchy title, he talks about people who have predicted that Jesus would return. There's a guy named Ignatius. He was actually a disciple by the Apostle John. Ignatius said this in AD 110. He said, the last days are upon us. Weigh carefully the times. Look for him who is above all time, eternal and invisible. That's AD 110. And then a church father named Martin in AD 375 said, there is no doubt that the Antichrist has already been born. This is AD 375. No doubt that the Antichrist has already been born, firmly established in his early years. He will, after reaching maturity, achieve supreme power. You've probably heard about Y2K. You probably didn't know there was a Y1K. That in AD 999, there were Christians who began, prognosticating that, at the end of the first millennium, after Jesus had ascended, that would usher in the return of Christ. And so actually, there were people, Christian farmers, who didn't plant their crops. and basically got into this waiting mode, and it actually caused a downturn in the economy, and it took 30 years for the church in the world at that point in time to recover from that idea that Jesus was returning at AD 1000. Martin Luther, the reformer, said this in the 1500s. He said, "We have reached the time of the white horse of the apocalypse. This world will not last any longer than 100 years." We're still here. There was a Catholic priest in 1877 who wrote a book about the return of Christ. It was so compelling and it was so impressive. He was talking about that Jesus would return in 1878. The Catholic Church read the book and again were so overwhelmed with his brilliance that they published the book and made it available in 1879. Yeah, I think you get the point. We're still here. The Jehovah's Witness Church has been predicting the return of Christ for quite some time. It began that Jesus was going to return in 1874, then it was 1940, then it was 1950, and then it was 1974. And some would say that by sheer dumb luck, maybe they will get it right at some point in time. Some of you may remember an author by the name of Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And he had this idea that, well, because of Bible prophecy, that because Israel became a nation in 1948, that one generation after 1948, which he calculated to be 40 years, that Jesus would return in that period, which prompted a NASA scientist to write a book called 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988. And he was super helpful because he actually narrowed it down to between September 11th and September 13th. And get this just proves our gullibility on this topic. Christians sold their homes and wanted to enjoy their equity before Jesus returned. Some Christians even put down their pets so that their pets would not fall into the hands of unbelievers. Harold Camping, in 2011, he announced that on May 21st of 2011, Jesus would return. When May 21st came and went, he recalculated and said, sorry, my math was bad. It's actually October 21st, 2011. And that day came away. Some of you may remember the big billboards that were all over the highways announcing that Jesus would return. Look, here's the deal. Some of you should know, there is a 100% failure rate when it comes to predicting when Jesus will return. Jesus actually told his disciples one day, Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, he says, "No man knows the day or the hour. Only the Father knows when Jesus is going to return." And the unintended consequence of all these predictions is that it seems like the only people who talk about the return of Jesus have fallen out of the crazy tree and hit every branch on the way down to the ground. Which means that we become silent about this topic. Because if you open your mouth and you start talking about the return of Jesus, people are going to look at you like you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Like you've kind of lost it a little bit. But when you look into the scriptures, what you see is something that is quite remarkable. That actually in 25 of the 27 New Testament books, there is a reference to the return of Jesus. Let me just give you some contrast here for a moment. When it comes to topics, doctrinal topics, some of the ordinances that we engage in as a church, things like communion and baptism, you may know this, but in baptism, there's actually only 5 books in the New Testament that speak about baptism. And when you come to communion, there's 7 epistles that refer to communion, and it's mentioned 19 times. And yet, when you come to the topic of the return of Christ, the return of Christ is mentioned 307 times in the New Testament. If you were to just take all those occurrences and just spread them out over the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation, that'd be once every 13 verses, the writers of the New Testament are talking about the return of our Christ. Which means that in our day, here we are, the month of April in 2023, that as we think about where our world is, we need to talk about this. Because Jesus talked about it. John chapter 14. Let me just read this text to you as Jesus spoke about this. He said, "When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am." 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. First, the believers who have died will rise from their graves. Then together with them, we who are still alive and remain on the earth will be caught up into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Then we will be with the Lord forever." So encourage each other with these words. Think about this. The motive there is encouragement, not fear-based intimidation, but encouragement. Hebrews chapter 9. "And just as each person is destined to die once, and after that comes judgment, so also Christ was offered once for all time as a sacrifice to take away the sins of many people. He will come again, not to deal with our sins, but to bring salvation to all who are eagerly waiting for him." One day, Jesus was with his disciples, and he's walking through Jerusalem, and he begins to talk about the temple and about how the temple is going to be torn down. And he starts referencing the end times. And his disciples ask the question, when will these things take place? And I'm going to read to you some of Jesus' response. It's found in Matthew chapter 24. He says this, beginning in verse 37, "When the Son of Man returns, it will be like it was in Noah's day. In those days before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings right up to the time Noah entered his boat. People didn't realize what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them all away. That is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. 2 men will be working together in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding flour at the mill, one will be taken, the other left. So you too must keep watch, for you don't know what day the Lord is coming. Understand this, if a homeowner knew exactly when a burglar was coming, he would keep watch and not permit his house to be broken into. You also must be ready all the time, for the Son of Man will come when least expected." This is God's holy word. What I want to do is dig a little bit into this idea that Jesus presents to us and says, it's going to be like, when my return is going to be like it was in the days of Noah. Like, what does that mean? What kind of hints might Jesus be giving to us by making that statement? And then, what are a couple ways that we could respond? Not in fear, but actually with some urgency, knowing that this is a frankly, in our movement, the Christian Missionary Alliance, this is one of the key ideas that Christ is our coming King. And because it's so central to the New Testament message, what does that prompt out of us here today in Yakima in April 2023? So we should dive right in and just talk about the days of Noah. You probably know the story of Noah and the ark, and there's some factors I think that would be helpful to remember. People were preoccupied with their daily lives. I mean, they had their soccer practices, they had their dance classes, they had schools at classes at high school, they had their job to go to, they had plans for the weekend, they had vacations they were thinking about, they had things they wanted to purchase. They were just very preoccupied with the day in, day out things of normal living. And as that was happening in the days of Noah, there was also this moral decay. It's the second thing about the days of Noah. There was this increasing moral decadence. In fact, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, the writer of Genesis captures that for us and says these words. He says, "The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything people thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil." That people were preoccupied with their daily lives, and there was this moral decay. People were consistently, not just in their actions, but in their thinking. So much so to the point where what was right was now being called wrong, and what was wrong is now being called right. It's this upside down viewpoint of how lives should be lived. This was what it was like in Noah's day. People were preoccupied with their daily living. People had engaged in this moral decay, and then we find in the New Testament that actually Noah is preaching, and he's warning people. He's speaking, verse 5 of 2 Peter 3, "And God did not spare the ancient world except for Noah and the 7 others in his family. Noah warned the world of God's righteous judgment." So God protected Noah when he destroyed the world of ungodly people with a vast flood. You've got people preoccupied with their daily lives. You've got this upside down view of how we should live our lives. What is right is now being called wrong. What is wrong is now being called right. And then there's a voice speaking out saying, hey, just fair warning that God's not going to tolerate this forever. He's actually going to do something about that. And if you know the story of Noah, that warning was not heeded. Which leads to the next thing about the days of Noah is people didn't realize how serious things were. They just didn't recognize how serious things were. Some of you in the room may remember the day that Mount St. Helens blew. Some of you may remember the name Harry Truman. Not the president, but Harry Truman was this gentleman who lived on Spirit Lake. And as the earthquakes that were taking place under Mount St. Helens were taking place, the USGS, United States Geological Service, was giving warning, saying, "Hey, this mountain it's gonna blow." So they're evacuating people. And Truman's like, "No, I'm gonna sit on my porch in my rocking chair, and I'm just gonna watch this thing go off, and I'm not leaving my home." He's just kind of like this. Crusty older gentleman, like you're not going to tell him. It's like back in the day when someone's putting a freeway through a farmer's property, like, no way, I'm going to meet you out there with my shotgun. You're not making me move my property. And Truman was in his house, and what scientists say is because the mountain, if you know this, the mountain didn't go up at first. It went out. And it went out right in the direction of Harry Truman's house. And scientists say that he had like half a second. He probably had enough time to turn his head toward the noise before he was overcome by the blast of Mount St. Helens. A fair warning was given, yet the fair warning is ignored. People in Noah's day didn't comprehend how serious things were. And then you get to the last, I think, detail of what it was like in Noah's day, is that you get a sudden separation. So this is super sobering, a sudden separation. See, there's parties and there's banquets and there's all this stuff going on, and whatever day of the week it was, and little did people know that the next day the world would completely change. There's a sudden separation. Years ago, when Trina and I were living in Southeast Asia, we had planted a church in Hong Kong, which is my hometown. I grew up in Hong Kong. And we were planting a church there, and it was Christmas time. And someone from the U.S. sent a gift to us to go on vacation. Now, I grew up in that area of the world, and I went to boarding school in Malaysia, and there's one town in Thailand that I've always wanted to go to. It's called Phuket. And I wanted to go to Phuket and take the kids there. There's amazing snorkeling. It was a beautiful area. And so we made plans to go to Phuket. And then Trina had a dream one night, and she had this dream, and it troubled her so much. It was like a tidal wave came, and one of our kids was taken out in the tidal wave, and she woke up and said, I don't think we're supposed to go to Phuket. And we got into a bit of an argument because this was like a childhood dream of mine to go to Phuket. And I said, it's just a kind of a weird dream. And, let's not make our travel plans based on whatever you had for dinner last night that caused this dream to take place. And then my parents came to visit us, and my dad said, there's a place that's kind of like Phuket. It's actually cheaper, and it's on the other side of the peninsula there in Thailand, and you should maybe that's a place to go. And the word cheaper caught my attention, and so we changed our kind of towards the last minute. We changed our idea of where we're going to go. We didn't tell a lot of people. So on December 25th, it's Christmas in 2004. We're opening our gifts, and we have one gift. We haven't told our kids we're going on vacation. And so we open this last gift, and it says, we're going to Thailand for a vacation, and we're going to go down to this town, and the kids were all excited, and we were leaving that night. So Christmas night, 2004, we get on a plane, we fly to Thailand, we land in Bangkok, get there about midnight, and we hire a driver to take us down to this hostel. There's no internet, there's no TV, it's a hostel. We didn't have a ton of money. So we get there about 3 a.m, and we're having the time of our life. I mean, it's just a great vacation. We're riding elephants, we're snorkeling, we're enjoying the beach. And about 2 days into the vacation, someone says to us, isn't it horrible about that tsunami? And we're like, what tsunami? Because we don't have internet, we don't have TV, and nothing. I said, oh yeah, there's this earthquake off the coast of Indonesia, and this massive tsunami. It just wiped out so many people. And if you remember this tsunami came, and over 250,000 people lost their lives. And immediately I was like, Trina, your dream. We get to an internet cafe, we log on, and sure enough, we read these. Actually, we had an email from my mom saying, we haven't heard from Steve and Trina and the kids. It's been 2 to 3 days. We can only assume that, the worst. And so I'm reading this, Trina, it's like, they think we're dead. And so I write to my mom, hi mom, having a great time in Thailand. But the reality is that it was actually, it was a little blurb in the paper back in Hong Kong that we had been killed. And we got back to Hong Kong, and there were people in my kids' schools, teachers who lost their lives in that tsunami. There were students whose funerals we went to who lost their lives in that tsunami. Sudden separation. Christmas was Christmas and all the joy that Christmas brought. And the next day, the world changed for thousands upon thousands of families who lost loved ones in that tsunami. Friends, as we talk about the return of Jesus, the reality is that the return of Jesus is a sobering event for people who don't know about Jesus, and yet it's an exciting, encouraging event for those who have been waiting and watching and ready for the return of Jesus. And in Noah's day, you have people who are preoccupied with their daily lives, and this moral decadence that takes place. They're ignoring the warnings and don't comprehend how serious it is. And yet there's this one day a sudden separation, which is why Jesus in Matthew 24 says there's 2 men walking up a hill, and one disappears and one's left. And there's 2 women grinding flour at the mill, and then there's one there and one left. It's a sudden separation. And it's sobering to think about that. Would actually, with all that leads to so what do we do with it? So great, awesome. I mean, Jesus talks about this, and we see how much the New Testament is speaking about this. And yes, there are people who kind of go off the rocker a little bit about saying when it's going to happen. But because this is going to happen and Jesus will return, what's our response? What difference does this make for us in the day in which we live? Well, first of all, I think we can see the similarities between the days of Noah and our day. It doesn't take a whole lot of thinking to say, yeah, sometimes we get preoccupied with our daily lives. And I think sometimes, and we can make a bigger deal than it is, I mean, we can see that, hey, what was right is now being called wrong, and what was wrong is now being called right. We can see some of that. And we can hear the warnings, and I think we can see that people don't think it's a serious deal. And here we are talking about there's one day Jesus will return, and there will be a sudden separation. So what is our response? And I just suggest two things. First one is we need to get the word out about Jesus. Because if this is in fact what's happening, which the New Testament speaks to, what Jesus himself said, and what angels testify to, that in the same way you saw him ascend, he will return, then we need to tell people that Jesus is returning, and not tell it in such a way that the main message is to scare them into the kingdom, but actually to present a compelling picture of who Jesus is and how you want to be ready for him. In the prayer time we had even this morning, Ashley mentioned that, if Jesus were to return, what would be your response? Would it be joy? Would you run to him? Or would you maybe go in the back and hide a little bit? Or would you just sort of hang in the middle? What would your response be? And some of it is predicated on our own image of who we believe Jesus to be. You need to know that he's for you. You do know that Jesus likes you, right? He not only loves you, but he likes you. Some of you have grown up with a picture of an angry God who, yes, has paid your sin debt, but he's somewhat reluctant that he had to do it. That is not the picture of your Savior. He loves you, and I would even say better yet, he likes you and wants to be with you, which is why he's coming back. He wants to be with you. And this is a compelling picture that we get to offer people. The God who made you in his image enjoys you and actually wants to hang out with you. This is why you have the writer of Revelation, that picture of Jesus knocking on a door saying, hey, let me in. I want to have dinner with you. He wants to sit at the table with you. And we got to get that message out. That there is a kind and there's a tender, there's a compassionate, there's a loving God who's incredibly impressive and overwhelming, yet wants to be with you because he loves and likes you. We need to get the word out about who Jesus is. And the second thing I would say that's more probably applicable to us in the room today is we need to be ready. Alert and anticipating Jesus' return. I mean, what it means is not being preoccupied with the daily rhythms of life. It doesn't mean the daily rhythms of life are bad. No, that's why they're the rhythms. Right? We get up, we have breakfast, we have our coffee, we go to school or to our job or whatever our rhythms are. This is the common grace that we all get to experience. There's nothing wrong with the daily rhythms of life, but when they preoccupy and then when they become the priorities in our life, it actually erodes our readiness for the return of Jesus. And even as Dan was talking about this Bible class that you got, that this will prepare you and cause you to be more alert and ready your heart and spirit for the return of Jesus. So we need to recognize that, you know what, this is happening. And we must speak about it, even though yet there's some people who've spoken about it in some crazy different ways. Friends, we're going home. There's a day that we'll go home. So we need to get the word out that this is happening, and we ourselves need to ready our own hearts. Let me just wrap up with this final story. I mentioned that I grew up in Southeast Asia. My parents were missionaries with the CMA, and I went to boarding school in Malaysia. So what that meant was 8 months out of the year, I was not home. I was at a boarding school with a bunch of other missionary kids. Their parents are missionaries in places like Irian Jaya, Indonesia, the Philippines, India, Saudi Arabia. I mean, just all over Southeast Asia and beyond. And we would leave for 4-month periods and then come home for 2 months and then go back to school for 4 months. Now, I was 9 years old the first time that I left home. And by the way, boarding school was a great experience for me. I have really great memories of boarding school. But what I hated were goodbyes. I remember going to the airport with my parents and other missionaries from our field, and being at the airport and having to say goodbye to my parents. We'd get on a plane. My brother was 2 years older than me. And we'd get on a plane and we'd fly 3.5 hours to Malaysia, be picked up by dorm parents, and they would take us to our boarding school. And there'd be 125 missionary kids at this boarding school. And every first night that you were away from home, you just listened in the rooms as we all went to rooms and had our roommates. We all cried ourselves to sleep that first night because we had to say goodbye. And we knew it was going to be a long time before we went home. The normal rhythms would kick into place in boarding school. And I remember my first year in boarding school in Malaysia, I had a couple of roommates from Thailand and another roommate from Cambodia. And their parents are missionaries with the CMA. And we had chores that we had to do every week. They had this little calendar, and there was 18 weeks marked out with chores. And, chores like taking the laundry out or cleaning the room, making your bed, whatever it was. And that little chore list became like a countdown calendar for us. Kind of like kids count down before Christmas. It was like this first week was like, when those chores were done, we marked off that week. And we looked at that thing, we said 17 weeks before we go home. And then we'd be, going on normal rhythms of life, and then we're at 15 weeks before we go home. And then just 12 weeks before we go home. Then it gets down to single digits. We're down to 9 weeks before we go home. And then there's this Thanksgiving banquet that happens in the fall. And we knew that you go to that Thanksgiving banquet, it's just weeks before you go home. And then there's the Christmas banquet. Now it's like 1 week before you go home. And then the day comes when you go to the school bulletin board, back when they had the bulletin boards, and they'd mimeograph papers, and some of you don't even have any idea what a mimeograph is. You don't know what you're missing. But they put this paper that smelled atrocious on the bulletin board, and it would have the flight schedules. And then we knew we were going home. And then the day would come, and our bags would be packed, and we had to be out, and the van would be ready for us. And we'd get in the van, and my brother and I would get in that van. They would drive us to the airport, and we'd get on a plane, and we'd fly 3.5 hours back to Hong Kong. We'd get off the plane and get our passports stamped, and we'd get our bags. And I remember this clear as a bell, and I could feel it right here. There was these 2 glass doors, and you walked up to them, and they would open, and then you would take a hard left, and there was this huge ramp that went down, and there was a sea of people waiting to see loved ones. And we would walk out those doors and take that hard left, and in the middle of the sea of people was my dad, who was a foot taller than everyone else in Hong Kong, with his arms up, waving. We were home. And we'd go down and we'd hug mom and dad. And our version of the wedding feast of the Lamb was McDonald's. And we'd eat Big Macs. And the next day, my parents would take us to a hotel that had a massive buffet. And we'd eat as much bacon and eggs and anything we could eat because we were home. Friends, you're going home. And one day, you're going to see your heavenly dad, who's a good dad, waving his arms at you because he wants to be with you. And there will be a feast. You need to know that there will be no more tears. There will be no more cancer. There will be no more Parkinson's. There will be no more disappointment. There will be no more pain in joints. There will be no more migraines. There will be no more Facebook. That sounds heaven to me. Because you are going to be home. And what the writers of the New Testament would say, encourage one another with these words. He's coming back to take you to be with him. Let's pray.